Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us. I am Anara Tabashaliva, along with co-host Dr. Victor Fett, Dr. Katerina Shrey, and our program producer, Professor Larry Sherray. We host a weekly discussion panel on Russia's war on Ukraine with guests from Ukraine, military experts, medical personnel, academics, artists, literary figures, and relief workers. Our panel is recorded and circulated nationally and internationally. We appreciate your comments and feedback. Special thanks to Marshall University Libraries and MUIT for making this weekly event possible. If you are joining us live on Teams, please feel free to use the chat to post any questions for our guests. A quick greetings to our viewers in Ukraine from Dr. Katerina Shrey.
Вітаємо наших слухачів в Україні з глибоким поклоном. Ми далі свідки вашого страшного терпіння і також вашої великої сили. Дякую вам за вашу участь в нашій тижневій програмі.
Thank you, Katerina. Today's guest will be introduced by Dr. Victor Fett.
Thank you, Anara. It is my pleasure and honor to welcome back our contributor, Dr. Alexander Motyl from New Jersey, Rutgers University. Dr. Motyl is one of our top Ukraine specialists. He wrote many books on the nationalism, revolutions, empires, and theory. And he joins us today with his take on the current situation in Ukraine and elsewhere. Dr. Motyl, it's our honor. Please, microphone is yours.
Your microphone is off.
Is that better? Can you hear me now?
Yes, it's good.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Thank you, Dr. Fett, for that kind introduction. I believe this is my fourth appearance on your program. And on the one hand, I'm always delighted to speak to colleagues. On the other hand, I wish the reason for the program were to disappear as soon as possible. Of course, if and when there is peace in Ukraine, we could still continue our discussions about reconstruction, reparations, and things of that sort. But for the time being, we are where we are. And as always, I'm grateful to you for inviting me. As always, I'm interested in the comments you might have after I finish delivering my brief presentation. Let me start with a simple observation, and that is the following. If you were following the news, and of course you were following the news and the various analyses, responses on the part of experts, about a month ago, maybe 2 months ago, the views of most people, not everybody, but the views of most people who were in this business were that Ukraine is on the verge of victory, that Russia is losing, couldn't possibly catch up, and so on. In any case, in other words, there was a sense of bullishness about the Ukrainian position. And that had a lot to do with the fact that Ukraine seemed to be doing quite well, was doing quite well with regard to drone warfare and things like that. If you read the press today and the analyses as well, there is a marked, or at least certainly a subtle shift in opinion, possibly even a marked shift in opinion. Again, I haven't done some kind of intense research on this, but it's just the impression I have from reading 5 to 10 different sources on a daily basis. And now there is a sense that somehow or other the Russians can make it. They may or may not be able to win, but they're certainly not going to lose. The Ukrainians are in for a tough time. The mood has shifted somewhat. I don't want to suggest that it's a 180-degree shift, but there has been a shift. What's striking to me is the fact that the reasons for the shift are not entirely evident. I mean, again, the primary reason, I think, is that Russia is firing ballistic missiles and Ukraine has run out of Patriot missiles or is on the verge of running out of Patriot missiles. It may be on the verge of getting some from a variety of countries, but at least for the time being, the Russians have a free hand in being able to target their missiles at Ukrainian civilian and occasionally military targets, but overwhelmingly civilian targets. And my guess is that that's the primary reason for this shift in opinion. Somehow Ukraine doesn't seem invulnerable, it seems highly vulnerable, and the Russians, well, look strong. And of course, that's true. That is to say, what's true is the fact that, yes, the Russians have been able to fire ballistic missiles pretty much at will, however, whenever they want to, wherever they want to. But to draw the conclusion from that particular fact that the tide has shifted, that now Russia seems to be on the verge of something that might be resembling a victory, is at least premature. I would suggest wrong, but let me be kind and simply suggest it's significantly premature. Because other than the ballistic missile business, everything else is pretty much as is, hasn't really changed. And none of the news, or at least very little of the news, is good for Russia, and most of the news is good for Ukraine. Again, with the significant exception of the ballistic missiles and the fact that they're being targeted at a pretty much defenseless civilian population. If you look at the Ukrainian side of the ledger, it's Ukraine's superiority in terms of drone warfare is still in place. It's still been able to, and indeed has significantly degraded Russia's ability to launch, not to launch, but it's degraded its energy infrastructure, it's degraded its ability, its planes, its bombers, its airfields, its command and control and communication centers. So Ukraine is doing exactly what it's supposed to be doing in this kind of warfare. It's focusing its drones and its occasional use of ballistic missiles on the strategic underbelly of the Russian war effort. If the Russians are unable to provide sufficient fuel, if they're unable to provide sufficient energy, not so much to the population, but to the frontline troops, they will sooner or later be incapable of waging war. That's just mathematics, if you like. It's just a question of numbers. So the Ukrainians are doing well on that score. And as you know, in recent months, or rather in recent weeks, they've targeted something like 30 Wildberries warehouses. These are the equivalent of Amazon. Some people think that's a waste of resources. Other people say it's actually a significant way of bringing the war home. Whatever the case, they've significantly disrupted a variety of supply chains within Russia. If one looks at the numbers, they too are striking and strikingly negative for the Russian side. Russia is losing about 30 to 35,000 men a month, and it's only recruiting something like 30 to 35,000, significantly less, somewhere between 25 and 30. That is fundamentally unsustainable. Again, it's just a question of arithmetic. You cannot wage a war where you're losing more men, more soldiers than you're recruiting on a monthly basis. And consider the following: the Russians are losing roughly 1,500 men per day, which is a phenomenal figure. I mean, if you just think about that. Again, I'm no military expert, but it's just a phenomenal figure. Ukraine is losing about 15 civilians on a daily basis. That's a ratio of 1,500 to 15. So roughly 100 Russian soldiers for every Ukrainian civilian. This is not to, I'm not suggesting that the civilian casualties are therefore bearable and should be ignored, but I'm simply suggesting that the price that Russia is paying for its targeting of civilians is extremely, extremely high. That's on the Ukrainian side of the ledger. So when it comes to the war, Ukraine is still doing very well. And Ukraine is defeating. I mean, the Russian troops have advanced minimally, if at all, within the last few months. The number of troops that have been killed on a daily, weekly, or monthly basis, as I've already said, is extremely high. Adding to Mr. Putin's troubles is the fact that the Russian economy isn't doing well. There is talk not just by dissident economists, but by official economists of an impending shortage of cash. The Russian population and Russian businesses are responding rationally. So Russians have withdrawn something like 5 billion rubles over the last few months. And of course, the reason for that being very simple. They fear that Putin will eventually start expropriating their assets, their bank accounts. Russian businessmen are acting in the very same manner, withdrawing their resources and lodging them, if at all possible, in places within the West. None of this bodes well for Putin. And if you simply look at the concatenation of forces, he's not advancing on the front. He's losing an inordinate amount of people, of soldiers. Yes, he's killing Ukrainians, and yes, he's destroying Ukrainian energy infrastructure as well. But at the same time, the war is coming home to Russia. And over the last few months, there have been, to my mind, there has been a significant uptick in criticism, both official and certainly unofficial, within Russia of the Putin regime and his policies. So all in all, if one takes these factors into account and brackets the tragedy, the human tragedy of people being killed by Russian missiles, the fact of the matter is that the conditions facing Mr. Putin are decidedly negative, and will not be easily remedied. Now, the question then arises, and this is the one that concerns Ukrainians, Russians, and everybody else, especially people of so-called goodwill, why doesn't Putin end the war? If things are going badly for him, why isn't he ending the war? Of course, one answer is that maybe perhaps we're wrong. Perhaps things are going well for him. Well, that seems an implausible conclusion based on the very simple numbers that I've already adduced. So what's exactly at issue here? Why doesn't he do the sort of thing that a rational leader would do? Declare victory, withdraw his troops, stage a variety of big parades, and say that he's managed to destroy the neo-Nazi regime, and so on. And he could easily do that. I mean, again, in principle, he could easily do that. So what's holding him back? One answer might be that he genuinely believes that Russia is capable of victory. And why would he do that? I mean, after all, he's the president, he's a former KGB officer. He must have access to a variety of significant information sources that provide him, or at least potentially provide him, with accurate information. Well, that may be true, and it's likely to be true, but it's also conceivable, it's also possible that he is the recipient of bad information. We know this from, we know this theoretically, we know this from the historical experiences of other countries. When you have a highly centralized regime within which buck passing and toady-like behavior are the norm, no one wants to provide the extraordinary great leader with bad news. Rather, the incentive is to provide him or her with good news or relatively neutral news. And we can see that, by the way, as a point of comparison with what's going on within the United States. It seems to be the case that President Trump gets news from that 35-year-old person who accompanies him throughout all his travels, Natalie Harp. She's no expert. She has an interest in keeping her boss happy. And it may be the case, again, this is simply a supposition on my part, that she's providing him with the kind of news that he wants to hear. Ditto for his other secretaries, within the cabinet. Well, if that is true, at least to some degree within the United States and more generally within a variety of other regimes, one can easily conclude that it's probably true within Russia as well. There is another possibility, and none of these are necessarily mutually exclusive, by the way. Another possibility is that Putin is driven overwhelmingly by ideology. And again, there's lots of evidence for the fact that he views Ukraine and Ukrainians as an artificial entity, as artificial entities that have no particular right to exist. And hence, and again, we could call this a fascist ideology, we could call it a genocidal ideology, we could call this a warmongering ideology, imperial ideology. Ultimately, it doesn't matter what we call it. But within this kind of ideological framework that he seems to ascribe to, the existence of Ukrainians, the existence of Ukrainians is simply impermissible. The continued existence of Russia depends on the non-existence of Ukraine, and the continued existence of Ukraine necessitates the non-existence of Russia. I mean, Putin seems to be a believer of this kind of binary choice. Given that kind of ideological predisposition, and one could supplement it with a variety of other factors related to imperial Russian ideology, Russian culture, and so on and so forth. But given all of that, it makes sense for him to continue the war because the choice for him is not it's not a question of of a mutually beneficial conclusion. His victory implies Ukraine's loss. Ukraine's victory implies Russia's loss. Ukraine's continued existence implies Russia's loss as well. So given this kind of binary world within which Putin seems to exist, the only viable solution to the war is Ukraine's defeat, capitulation, and preferably extermination as well. All of these are, these two factors are, I think, significant. I do think they play a role of some kind. My own personal preference is for the third, and let me just emphasize once again, all three actually go together very nicely, so it's hard to distinguish. It's hard to be able to say, this is the most important factor, this is the less important factor. I mean, they all seem to matter significantly, if not perhaps identically. Well, my own personal favorite, as I said, is that Putin has invested so much of his political career as well as of his physical existence and continuation of the war that he has essentially painted himself into a corner. He has created a situation within which Russia evidently isn't doing as well as it could or should be. And of course, we know that to be true because the war was supposed to end in 3 days to 3 weeks. And as said, we're in the 5th year. He's painted himself in the corner in as much as he's created a situation, a war which he cannot win. He's desperate for some kind of solutions. It's not clear what the solution is. I mean, he's tried drafting criminals and thereby emptying Russian prisons. He's relying on the Chinese. He's relying on the North Koreans. He's snarling at the West. He's making all sorts of threats. But the bottom line is that the fact that he's resorting to killing civilians and essentially committing genocide, or at least openly committing genocide, but the fact that he's devoted his efforts over the last several months to killing Ukrainian civilians is really just an affirmation of the fact that he understands that he's losing the war on the battlefield, in the skies, of course on the seas as well. If this is the best that Putin can do, then clearly he seems to appreciate that he's backed himself into a corner. What's the way out? Well, again, as I said, for a rational leader who wants simply to end the war and do what happens to be good for his people, declaring victory, staging a major parade in downtown Moscow would be the way to proceed. But he can't do that. he started a project, namely the war with which he has become intimately associated and identified. This is Putin's war from beginning to end. And Russians understand that. Certainly the elites understand that. Certainly a significant portion of the thinking population understands this as well. And I think Putin understands this too. So he's having backed himself into a corner and having realized that there is no easy way out. Putin simply has to continue fighting the war because anything else, anything resembling a rational solution, a ceasefire, something along those lines, would be to admit failure, and to admit political failure would be to admit that would be to invite a coup d'etat, or possibly a killing, his death by means of violence on the part of the FSB, the military, or other forces. So if we take these three factors into account, the fact that he may be getting insufficient information, the fact that, I forget what the second point was. Well, in any case, those three factors, let me just mention that when considers these three factors, one essentially comes up with this conclusion that Putin has no particular incentive to end the war. He's more than happy to sacrifice 1,500 soldiers. He may be forced to do something decidedly irrational, or at least decidedly risky as a result of his being backed into a corner. And when it comes to that, then two scenarios come to mind. One is there is increasing talk of an official mobilization. Again, he's unlikely to declare that officially, in as much as that might repeat what happened at the end of 2022, where somewhere between 500,000 to 1 million young Russians fled the country so as not to be drafted. And those were times when Russia looked like it was actually winning. Now, where 1,500 soldiers are losing their lives or being wounded, most Russians, or increasingly most Russians, are beginning to appreciate that being drafted is a one-way ticket to death in Ukrainian mud. So there's the possibility of a mobilization, but it's a risky procedure. It might solve the problem of inadequate resources, human resources for the time being, but it's unlikely to be sustainable as news continues to leak out that being mobilized, being drafted, being recruited, and being sent to the front essentially amounts to a suicidal mission. The other factor that people mention as a possibility, as a way of distracting the population, as a way of currying favor, enhancing his reputation, would be to engage in some kind of adventure vis-a-vis a small NATO country. And what immediately comes to mind is, of course, Estonia. The Estonians are fully aware of this, so too are the Europeans. What one can certainly, more or less certainly conclude, is that Putin is very unlikely to send in the tanks and the drones and the forces and invade Estonia. In as much as he's stuck within Ukraine, the last thing he needs is a second active front. But what certainly becomes far more plausible would be to stage a series of provocations. I think I've mentioned this before in this setting, a series of provocations involving the deaths of Russians or Russian speakers in or around Narva. One can easily set off a few bombs that would entail some Russian civilian losses. One could create a dummy Estonian fascist movement that claims credit for this kind of barbarism, whereas in fact all this would have been orchestrated by the FSB. And then one can easily imagine the local Estonian dummy front declaring its need for support from Mother Russia. Putin would not send in the tanks, but he might send in some little green men. In any case, he would be testing NATO's resolve. And my own sense personally is that if such a thing were to happen, something short of a full-scale invasion of Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, or so on, the response on the part of most NATO countries would be to turn away in embarrassment, declare their opposition to Russian aggression, but do nothing. Now, what would that accomplish? What would such a thing accomplish? Well, for one thing, it would discredit NATO and would reveal it to be a paper target. It would presumably enhance Putin's reputation at home, since he could argue that it's not just the Ukrainian neo-Nazis that he's fighting neo-Nazis all over the world, and therefore requires the support of Russians. Some Russians will probably respond negatively to these kinds of appeals. Others, on the other hand, would probably respond with some degree of enthusiasm. Certainly the Patriarch Kirill would agree that such a move would necessitate a forceful Russian response. And of course, there are people like Medvedev and others who would probably encourage Putin to drop an atom bomb or two on Tallinn or some other places. Now, none of that is likely to take place, that is to say, an attack by nuclear weapons, but it's certainly a way of terrifying Europeans and Americans, and in fact, the world with respect to Russian intentions. Where is this all going to go? Well, at least for the time being, there seems to be no reasonable end, or at least no reasonable expectation to imagine that the war will end. Russia is hoping that the winter within Ukraine will be as severe as last year's. That may or may not be the case, but in any case, they're likely to intensify their attacks on energy infrastructure so as to make the winter as uncomfortable for Ukrainians as possible. The problem with that strategy is that historical experience has shown that it doesn't work. When you bomb a population, it doesn't turn them to you, it turns them away from you. We know this from the experience of the Vietnamese and the American attacks on North Vietnam. We know this with regard to the experience of the Brits during the Battle of Britain, the Germans in 1944 and 1945. In other words, air power can accomplish a variety of things, but it can't force a population to declare, to surrender. It generally doesn't do that, or it doesn't seem to do that under any circumstances. And quite the opposite, it's likely to turn the Ukrainian population with even greater hatred and distaste for Russia. So that's not likely to happen. That's not likely to work, but it's likely to happen simply because Putin is rapidly running out of options. Ukraine, in contrast, Ukraine, on the other hand, will continue striking strategically important targets. Notice this is very important. I may have mentioned this before, but by degrading Russia's energy infrastructure, but by attacking its air bases and things like that, it's not just causing havoc. Ukraine is degrading Russia's ability to wage the war. And that's ultimately the most important fact. Can we expect an end to the war anytime soon? My own sense is probably not, unless, and I'll end on this point of speculation, unless certain Russians take matters into their own hands and stage a coup d'etat against Putin. It's been argued by many people that can't possibly happen. There doesn't seem to be anybody on the horizon who's interested in staging a coup, and therefore a repetition of the Prigozhin affair of 2023 is highly unlikely. Quite the opposite. Putin seems to be fairly stable. He's in the saddle and things are unlikely to change. That may very well be true, but we shouldn't forget that when one looks at Russian and Soviet history, Russian imperial, Soviet, and post-Soviet history, this is a calculation that I did a few months ago. Something like 40 to 45% of the leadership turnovers were by means of violence or coercion. So Russia is no stranger to coups. And there's no reason to think that just because it seems unlikely, it is therefore unlikely. And the reason being is that we know the situation within Russia economically, socially, is not good. We know that this frontline situation is not good. We know that the economy will worsen. We know that the population has been affected by the war as a result of the Wild Berries campaign. And we know that there is a fairly significant number of military bloggers, officials, and others like that who are increasingly critical of Putin. I'll just mention one fact here that you may or may not be aware of. Back in April, Sberbank issued a study in which they calculated the various scenarios. Presumably the study reached Putin, if not reaching him, it certainly reached his inner circle. They calculate, and then they came up with something like 10 or 15 scenarios for how the war might end. They concluded that the likelihood of a Russian victory was something like 7 or 8%. Now, this is out of a total of 100% distributed throughout. Some of the other scenarios were a bit more optimistic, but the bottom line was that even the economists at the Sberbank came to the conclusion that this is a lost proposition. Will Putin submit to this kind of thinking? I think not. As I mentioned, there are at least 3 good reasons for being doubtful. On the other hand, the likelihood, both theoretical, historical, of some kind of move against Putin is growing with every year, with every month, possibly with every week. I won't go so far on the limb as to suggest that a coup will happen, but I will go out on the limb insofar as I'll suggest that with every month of war and with every month of negative news for Russia, the likelihood of a coup becomes increasingly higher. Let me end on that semi-optimistic note. And if you have any comments, questions, criticisms, I'd be more than happy to entertain them. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Dr. Motyl. And I already have a question right here from Dr. Leonard Deutsch, our former graduate dean. Len, please.
Some Ukrainians are calling for overdue elections, democratic elections in Ukraine. Some have been critical of Zelensky because of his reassignment of the man who headed up the drone initiative. How precarious do you see Zelensky's position, and how would that affect the balance of power?
Well, for the time being, I'd say he's, quote, firmly in the saddle. It's hard for me to imagine a coup in Ukraine. That said, clearly he's been under attack. Less so, I mean, it's not so much that people are charging him with corruption, not with him personally, but his administration, his regime, call it what you like, is being accused of engaging in a variety of corrupt practices. And inasmuch as these are people whom he hired, clearly the blame begins to affect him as well. Has that weakened him? Yes, except for the fact that there is no obvious alternative at the moment. Now, again, I'm beginning to sound like someone who's just rejecting his argument vis-a-vis Putin. But the military is unlikely to stage a coup. The Ukrainian Secret Service is unlikely to stage a coup. What is possible, and of course there we have a whole series of events along these lines, would be for Ukrainians to take to the streets and demand Zelensky's resignation. Now, there have been several instances of those sorts of mass mobilizations, some of them very recently. They haven't been so much directed at him personally, but that could change. Would that then lead him to take a step, take such a step as to resign, that's not inconceivable. I don't think it's likely to happen, but it's not inconceivable that he could resign. Unlike Putin, whose life literally, politically, and naturally depends on the war's outcome, Zelensky is fine. If he were to resign today, he'd probably get an invitation from Harvard to teach there for 3 years, or perhaps from Marshall University. But the point is, he could always, retreat, settle down, write his memoirs, and return as Ukraine's great hope, so to speak. So his position is becoming increasingly less solid, certainly in comparison to 2022. But he's still holding on, and I don't see any major changes anytime soon. But that said, you never know, right? Now, one of the problems with the claim that there should be democratic elections, I mean, on the one hand, everybody agrees, of course, why not? Sure, it's high time for there to be presidential and parliamentary elections. The president seems to have accumulated too much power. He may or may not be responsible for the corruption. The parliament is essentially a kind of rubber stamp parliament doing whatever the president wants. It's incapable of taking initiatives, and all of that's perfectly true. The problem becomes technical. How do you hold elections when 10 million people are abroad, when there's a war being waged, when bombs are being thrown on Ukrainian civilian targets, and so on and so forth? And that's the criticism of Mr. Fedorov, the Minister of Defense, who called for elections. And the immediate response on the part of a variety of serious people was, well, it's all very nice to call for elections, but how do you expect to do this? Now, I've spoken with a friend of mine who knows more about electoral systems than I do, and he says it might be possible if you extend the period of voting from 1 day to 3 weeks, if you permit people to vote in a variety of places as opposed to the consulate only. So maybe there is a technical solution to the problem. But clearly it's not easy. It would require a whole bunch of finagling, which would require the approval of the parliament and the president, and they're disinclined to approve. But clearly, if there were elections, and if Zelensky won, that would enhance his legitimacy, his popularity. At this point in time, were there to be elections, he's likely to lose. The person who is everybody's favored is the former the general Zaluzhny, who led the campaign for the first 2 years. He's now Ukraine's ambassador to the UK, and occasionally produces these pronouncements on how the war should or should not be fought. He's very popular. Mr. Fedorov is popular as well. So it's not inconceivable that he's engaging in the kind of politicking that he's currently been engaging in order to enhance his electability. But all of this depends on whether or not Zelensky agrees to hold elections. And as long as they are difficult to do technically, he will be right in suggesting that they shouldn't be held. And as I said, that's the big question mark. And it's a question mark that I can't answer since I just don't have the expertise and how electoral systems can be played with in order to make them more accessible under conditions of duress and extreme stress.
Thank you.
Well, thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Motyl. As we are waiting for other questions and comments, I would necessarily ask you to comment on Europe, because while United States seems to be outside of this irrational equation, I personally have a feeling that we don't know enough of what's going on behind the scenes, from German explosions to possible Baltic attack, which you mentioned. But how does political situation in Europe, how has it changed? How does it bear on what may be important for Ukraine in next few months?
Let me give you some of the good news and the bad news.
Yes.
But I'll start with the bad news. The bad news is that, many of the European countries, including France and Germany, are going to have elections fairly soon. And as you all know, I mean, the alternative for Germany is doing quite well in Germany. That's the, whether it's neo-fascist or neo-Nazi, I don't know, but it's clearly very much on the right. And it tends to favor Mr. Putin. So there's at least a possibility that that it will enter the Reichstag. And there's at least a possibility that he might be involved in the negotiations regarding a government. Were that to happen, then that would complicate Germany's relations with Ukraine significantly. And the same is true of France. Elections are likely to will be held fairly soon. Mr. Macron is not going to win. And there is, of course, a possibility that the French National Front, led by Marine Le Pen, may do quite well and be in the position to establish its own leader. The person on the extreme left, Mélenchon, is also inclined to support Russia and Putin. Fortunately, this dynamic doesn't seem to be present within the United Kingdom so far. But if Mr. Farage comes to power, and again, that's not inconceivable, who knows? Then all bets could be off. This obviously matters because right-wing governments that are pro-Putin, pro-Russia, would be unwilling to spend money on Ukraine, would be unwilling to provide it with the support that it's been getting thus far. They might change their country's policies away from Ukraine towards Russia. And again, all of this is at least conceivable, thinkable, and possible. The good news is that, and again, this is good news that goes in the opposite direction from the bad news. In other words, it contravenes that bad news, is that partly thanks to Mr. Trump and his desire to extricate the United States from European affairs, mostly due to the fact that Mr. Putin has not concealed his imperialistic intentions vis-a-vis not just Ukraine, but many other places as well. He's also shown that he's more than happy to engage in highly destructive anti-civilian warfare. Thanks to these two factors, Europe, which existed in a kind of limbo until recently, it was provided with security by the United States. Russia seemed to be a more or less amicable country with which one could trade. And one didn't need to exert oneself too much in terms of security issues, in terms of defense, in terms even of thinking about what Ukraine, Belarus, and Russia mean for Europe. Well, that's changed. And the logic of the situation, again, I emphasize the word the logic of the geopolitical logic, now militates against this kind of lackadaisical attitude. The Europeans increasingly understand that they are going to be responsible for their own security, that the United States cannot be trusted. I mean, the recent flap with Canada has only reinforced the view that the United States has a peculiar attitude towards its allies, and Mr. Trump's embrace of the North Korean dictator also shows that it has a peculiar attitude towards his sworn enemies. In any case, the Europeans seem to understand that something needs to be done, that it's up to them to take care of their own security. It's up to them to deal with the absence of America from their calculations, from the overwhelming presence of Russia in terms of their geopolitical interests. And they are increasingly persuaded that Ukraine doesn't just matter because it's a nice country whose human rights have been violated, but that it is absolutely essential to European security as well. This is a point that colleagues and I have been making since 1991. And I can say with complete certainty, based on my own experience, that when made the point that Ukraine really was important to European security, the response on the part of virtually every European I met or spoke to was a yawn and a ho-hum. It simply didn't matter. Well, now they appreciate that it does. And as a result of these factors, and as a result of these positive trends, many of the Europeans have taken significant steps to support Ukraine with armaments, with money, with technical assistance, and the rest. The question remains, and this is one that I can't answer other than to suggest that it could be explosive, is that we have the geopolitical logic pushing Europe towards Ukraine and away from Russia. But then you've got the domestic political possibility on the part of these right-wing movements pushing in the other direction. And which side will be victorious in the coming battles? I personally don't know. My guess is that Europeans will at some point come to their senses, even those on the moderate right, and recognize that Putin is no friend. But I just don't know. We'll simply have to see how things develop. Thank you.
Thank you. Any more questions or comments, please? We have a few minutes. Open your camera and microphone if you want to ask Dr. Motyl a question. Anara, please.
Thank you very much for your outstanding presentation. It was very interesting and actually not inspiring, but very interesting. What are your recommendations for how the US should help Ukraine, at least in this year? And my second question, what do you think about performance of the US special envoy in Ukraine? How we can, nobody talks about them, but they are somehow very close, people very close to Trump. That's what do you think about their performance?
Let me start with the second point.
The second, what do you think about the US special envoy to Ukraine for actually, and what their roles and their possibilities to change something?
Well, again, you obviously have in mind Mr. Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner.
Mm-hmm.
And all I can say is that two real estate moguls from New York who have no diplomatic experience, who have no knowledge of Russia and Ukraine and that part of the world more generally, who have no knowledge of the history of that part of the world. And again, I don't mean just Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, but it incorporates the entire Soviet Union, the other republics that happen to be part of the Soviet Union. I mean, how can one expect someone who is ignorant and who has made money on the basis of real estate deals in New York to be capable of negotiating with Mr. Putin or Mr. Lavrov or anybody else? I mean, that's just bizarre. And it's no wonder to me that the United States has made no progress in this particular respect. I mean, I would imagine, my guess is, I have no empirical basis for this, but I would imagine that Putin, Lavrov, and their colleagues are laughing every time these two guys show up in Moscow. They're not serious. I mean, clearly the Americans can't possibly be really serious if this is the kind of, if these are the kinds of diplomats that they're mustering. So I'm distraught. I'm not surprised, because when one considers the quality of many of Mr. Trump's appointees, they are all pretty much in the same camp. People who are ignorant of the fields that they're supposed to deal with, people who think they know everything, simply because they made a name for themselves somewhere in the world, but who in fact know very little about what it is that they're doing. Now, I can go on and on about this, but I'm going to stop there since this is a talk about Russia, Ukraine, and not about the United States. So for starters, if I were recommending what the United States should do, I would fire Witkoff and Kushner. I would tell them to go back home, to start making more money on Manhattan real estate, and to leave diplomacy to people who know something about diplomacy. That would mean getting genuine diplomats with a background in Russia or Ukraine. They could be Republicans, they could be Democrats. Of course, to say that they could be Democrats is to engage in an impossible task, because there's no way that Mr. Trump would appoint a Democrat to any position. But the point is, there are serious Republicans who do know Russia, who do know Ukraine, or at least to some degree know them, who have some experience in terms of diplomacy. So that would be my first recommendation.
Mm-hmm.
Everything else follows from that, but it becomes increasingly unrealistic. I would suggest that the United States should do what Mr. Biden did, namely provide Ukraine with patriots, with missiles, with rockets, with ammunition, with support. Mr. Biden was criticized for being unclear as to what he wanted. That's true. He was criticized for not giving enough or always being a little, too late. But he was clearly committed to Ukraine. He did provide a lot, even if it was a little too late. And he provided far more than Mr. Trump, who's essentially providing zero. In terms of any kind of assistance, which is why I'm not exactly optimistic. I mean, here I am suggesting what the United States should do. People far more influential than me have been making similar suggestions. They've been writing articles about this, and they generally frame it in such a way as to increase Trump's stature, namely, here's an ideal opportunity for the United States to make a significant difference, win the war, bring about peace, win a Nobel Prize. You got to do this as quickly as you possibly can, because here's this unique opportunity which will benefit you, blah, 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 blah. But clearly, speaking that way doesn't seem to have any kind of influence on the administration, doesn't seem to have any influence on Mr. Trump. And his attitudes towards Ukraine, while they're no longer quite as dismissive as they used to be, he no longer calls Zelensky a salesman or something like that, or a circus trainer. But his attitude is still standoffish. Let me be polite.
Mm-hmm.
And his views of Putin, his views of Xi Jinping, his views of the North Korean dictator, I forget his name, are essentially positive, which suggests that the final analysis, Mr. Trump supports them, admires them more than he does Zelensky and Ukraine. Now, how does that influence his policies? It's not clear. It may be that this is the reason why he's reluctant to do anything significant to help Ukraine. Some people have suggested that that Trump is a Russian asset. I'm somewhat skeptical, but on the other hand, you never know in this crazy world. It's not inconceivable that he has certain connections with the Russian FSB. It's not inconceivable. But the bottom line is that he's demonstrated by his actions and by his rhetoric that he has no particular interest in ending the war in a way that would be equitable for Ukraine. Just 2 days ago, I believe, the United States refused to sign a resolution condemning the Russian aggression in Ukraine at the United Nations. Now, this baffles me. Most UN resolutions are basically meaningless documents in practical terms. It's not as if they obligate the United States or anybody else to take action against Russia, but they're essentially a statement of intent, an affirmation of certain values. So why not say we condemn the aggression? What difference does it make? It's not as if Putin will get insulted and refuse to meet with American envoys. But yet they do this. And this isn't the first time. I believe this is the second or third time that they've done this. And there have been other settings where the United States has refused to condemn Russian behavior as well. And that ultimately suggests to me that when push comes to shove, Trump would prefer to be on Putin's side. Circumstances may get in the way. The fact that Putin is waging a genocidal war may make it somewhat uncomfortable for Trump to condemn him. But in the final analysis, if Putin were to win and then invite Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner to be his partners in Russia's economic rebirth, quote unquote, I don't think Mr. Trump would be terribly opposed to such an outcome, unfortunately.
Yeah,
Thank you
that's
for your
very scary.
attention.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Motyl. We are nearly out of time on this hour, but it would be rather sad to end on this fantastic note. Although, may I ask one more question? Maybe you can clarify something on the strange visit of CIA chief to Moscow, which I guess we don't know what it was.
And that's essentially all I can say is I don't
Yeah.
know what it was. I mean, I've read some analyses by people who have better connections with Washington, and they all say what I'm about to say is based on ignorance.
Yeah.
So it may be that he went there to warn Putin about something, maybe about Ukraine, maybe about attacking Estonia, or it may be, in other words, he went there from a position of strength in order to impose American views on Putin. Possible. Alternate, but it doesn't seem all that likely given, Trump's love affair with Putin. The other possibility is that he went there with hat in hand, hoping that the Russians would agree to somehow resolve the Iranian war crisis. That suggests a very different argument, namely that the United States went into this meeting essentially from a weaker position, hoping that Russia might be able to help it. As far as I'm concerned, both of these are plausible. And one can add any number of alternative scenarios, and it's conceivable that all of these scenarios were under discussion. What's important, however, is that as far as we know, Ratcliffe did not meet with Putin. So he seems to have met, I assume, with Lavrov, possibly some other individuals, which kind of diminishes the importance of the meeting. Had he met with Putin in the manner that Witkoff and Kushner had done, one could at least argue that something important was being discussed between important people. But as is, in the final analysis, perhaps he went there so as to discuss a conference between the FSB and the CIA. I mean, I'm being facetious, of course, but we just don't know.
Thank you. We have one final question, please, Leslie Titus.
Yes, so if nobody else asked about, I was going to ask about the John Ratcliffe's trip to Moscow, but you already covered that. So yes. I'll give one opinion and one possibly sort of hopeful comment. My opinion is that I know there's a lot of discussion about whether or not Trump is a Russian asset. My own opinion at this point is that Trump isn't necessarily a Russian asset in the traditional sense of knowing that he's working for Russia, but I definitely think that he's going back to when he made a trip to Moscow in the 80s, had conversations with Russians who were, she's almost certainly had conversations with Russians who were in the KGB and now the FSB, and has his opinion influenced in that way. But my more hopeful
I agree with you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
My more hopeful comment, which I also put in the chat, is that after I think they discovered a explosive drone at an airport in Germany some time ago, Germany has announced that it's going to be working on beefing up its security and intelligence services. which is a good move. So
and of course
that's my one hopeful note.
Well, the Brits, the French, the Danes, the Dutch, I mean, the Finns, I mean, everybody seems to be aware of the threat that Putin poses, and they are taking measures. So that's the good news. By the way, let me end on a positive note. I think Ukraine is winning. I emphasize, Putin and his reluctance to accept reality, but the reality is that Ukraine is winning. And short of a decision by the Europeans or the Americans to cut off all aid and to side with the Russians, it's going to win. I wish it were, the victory would take place tomorrow. If not tomorrow, then a few months from now. I'm not sure. Again, it might take a few more years, but I do think the Ukrainians are going to win. For all the reasons that I suggested, primarily because partly because the Ukrainians are in a strong position, but mostly because the Russians are in an increasingly weaker position. And at some point, Russia will lose, and ipso facto, Ukraine will have won.
That's a good final statement. And we thank you, Dr. Motyl, for being with us this hour, for your expertise in sharing this particular page of history book. We are all living in it every moment, and
Yes.
as all of us, we wake up every morning reading another page from this unfortunate textbook, which is being written right now by you and others and many. Thank you so much. I will ask Dr. Shrey to say a few final words, please, Katerina.
Дорогі браття і сестри в Україні, ми зберігаємо вас у наших щоденних думках і молитвах. Нехай милосердний Бог тримає вас у своїй опіці. До наступного тижня. Прощаємося.
Слава Україні!
Героям
Героям
слава!
слава. Thank you, everybody, for the invitation. It is always a pleasure to meet with colleagues who have such a wide range of interests, one of which happens to be Ukraine and Russia. Thank you. Till we meet again.
Thank you.
Thank you.